Good evening. A warm welcome to all of you as participants of the first international conference on climate engineering. And I must say it's a very big honor you are here tonight for the panel discussion on climate engineering and the meaning of nature. I warmly welcome you also in the name of Director Johannes Vogel, who can't be with us tonight. I am Katrin Voland. I'm head of the research department, public engagement with science. And we organize this conference together with the ISS and namely with Jamais. So thank you very much. It was also very inspiring work on this conference. Before we really start, I think Stefan Schäfer has to make some announcements.
It's on? Yes. Excellent. Good evening, everyone, also from my side. And first off, I would like to, on behalf of the steering committee, really thank our hosts for tonight. We're very grateful for this excellent collaboration around the event. And then I would, for those of you who might not have attended this afternoon's excellent presentation by Thomas Saraceno, repeat some information that I gave in the lead-in to that presentation, which is that because of the strong interest that was voiced in having a deeper discussion around the draft statement that was proposed to the conference by Steve Rene, we've saved some space tomorrow afternoon between 5 and 6 in Aurora Borealis 3 to deepen that debate and have a conversation. And there'll also be space afterwards to continue the conversation in a smaller forum. And I would also like to repeat what I mentioned during my overview of the program during the opening, which is that we offered some space for offering ad hoc sessions during the conference, and these are coming together, and you can find information on them opposite of the conference office on a pinboard. So please do stop by and see if there are any additional sessions that you would like to visit. Thanks.
So thank you. So you are at a very special place here. The museum was founded already 1810 and took 3 museums together at the Humboldt University of Berlin. But quite rapidly the original building became too small, and this very building has been built. 1888 this building came into work. We suffered from Second World War. Large parts of the buildings had been destroyed, and the rebuilding only took place a very few years ago. But now it hosts one of the most modern collections of a wet collection. Perhaps you have a little bit of time, you can move around and have a little glance of this collection. From a scientific point of view, one of the major impacts has been when the museum departed from the Humboldt University and became part of the Leibniz Association. The Leibniz Association in Germany is one of the 4 big science associations, such as Max Planck, Fraunhofer, Helmholtz. Also the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research is part of this Leibniz Association. So all the work of the museum is now assessed according to scientific criteria. So currently, our museum is organized in 4 research programs. It's evolution and geoprocesses, collection development for biodiversity research, digital world and information science, and public engagement with science. And I thought I could show you this picture. This is an example of this research which is done in this science program, Evolution and Geoprocesses. We have a group which is dealing with impact research. It's mainly dealing with the impact of meteorites and the outbreaks of volcanoes. So it's interesting, I thought, for you to perhaps grasp a bit more via the internet for 2 reasons. One, obviously, is a scientific one. So the impact of volcanoes and meteorites of the atmosphere is quite big. So if we consider this as some kind of solar radiation, I wouldn't say management, it's rather solar radiation change, you can realize it really has severe impacts. Today, it's assumed that the dinosaurs, they died out because of a combination of this impact of meteorites and volcanoes. So that might be also considered if we talk about solar radiation management. But there's another also interesting aspect to this topic. There's a study which is dealing with the question how climate engineering is framed in the public. And there are some storylines which compare climate engineering with the outbreaks of volcanoes. And there are some studies from acceptance research, and then they revealed if climate engineering or geoengineering is framed like a natural process like volcano outbreaks, acceptance of the population increased immediately. So that might be interesting. I also would like to give you an insight to another interesting research area, which will be done by my colleague, PD Dr. Barbara Moore. She is curator of the Paleobotanical Collection, and she will give us some insight about the processes beyond the surface of the oceans.
Thank you, Catherine. So I would like to ask the question, what might be the role of our museum in the attempt to actively shape our planet? Well, to answer this question, we chose for this short introduction just one example from the field of paleobiology, more precisely from diatom research. The scientific work on which we focus here has been mainly accomplished by David Lazarus and Joanne Renaudie, two micropaleontologists here at the museum. Of great importance is the fact that diatoms account for many percentages of uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. Therefore, consequences might be severe when diatom diversity and productivity might drop during the next decades or centuries. Thus, there is a genuine need to understand the connection between diatom diversity and climate change. Diatom diversity, however, can be only estimated when there is a sound taxonomic knowledge of this extremely diverse group of unicellular algae. And this is one of our strongholds, grounded in over 150 years of expert taxonomic work and marvelous historic collections. This mid-19th century sketch, which you see here, drawn by Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg, highlights differing morphologies of this group. Ehrenberg was during his time what you would call Mr. Microscope. In other words, he was one of the first zoologists who used the microscope to describe, name, and understand microorganisms, and the first one who clearly was aware of the immense diversity and abundance of these infusoria, as these microorganisms were called during those times. Next one. Ehrenberg's collections had been curated by his daughter Clara, who drew also this nice watercolor picture, which you see here, which shows Ehrenberg's private study with his microscope and the collection of slides in special book-like containers. Next. The smear slides are made from very thin mica slices, not glass, as today. And the tiny paperings mark the taxonomically important taxa, which one would call today type specimens. Ehrenberg got his material from all over the world, for example, also from Darwin and his samples taken during his voyage with a beagle. These samples and the slides The samples are in boxes, and the slides you see here all over the picture. These samples and slides made from the material were handed to our museum after Ehrenberg's death in 1876. Since then, these roughly 500 samples, 40,000 slides, and 3,000 sheets with scientific drawings are one of the many treasures held here in this building. Next one. Modern research on marine Cenozoic diatoms has another focus. The main question is, how are climate change and diatom diversity linked? In order to answer this question, many data have been put together using direct observation from slides, but also data from an extended database, Neptune, with data from the International ODP-IODP drilling program. The coordinates of this graph show in the lower part the timeline running from the right from 60 million years to the Holocene. So the time span is the Tertiary. And the second coordinate shows on one side the number of diatom taxa and also values of delta O18 measurements, which reflect seawater temperatures. And this is a fraction. Therefore, it's so both curves run parallel, but the delta O18 curve is inverted. So what is seen here as to be low on the curve is in fact high. So in the early Tertiary, you had high temperatures, and of course, during the Holocene, you had low temperatures. And the curve shows clearly that during those times when it was warm, sea temperatures were warmer than today, CO2 values were higher, then the diatom values or the diatom diversity was also rather low. Next one. So, one might very briefly say, diatoms don't like it hot. So, all our thinking to improve fertilities of diatoms, for example, to increase the sink of CO2 might be vain when the group has major problems to survive. This can be either due to pollution, since diatoms are highly sensitive to toxicants, and, as we pointed out here, to climate change. To wrap this up, more diversity studies of this sort should be done to increase the understanding of our environment, and these studies are the first stepstones that help to prepare further activities. Now I would like to give you again the...
So, thank you. Thank you very much. For the insight. So we will discuss with Rene Rospel that diatoms neither like pollution nor heat. Even if the museum is doing excellent research, it's mainly known for its exhibitions. So you're sitting here. We have about 500,000 visitors a year. And we also have a variety of education programs, reaching also thousands of teachers, adults, pupils. And we are also part of the rising citizen science community. I think this all opens access to a public dialogue about science with the public. I personally came into contact with this topic of climate engineering during the international negotiations of the CBD. And I personally think that this topic will gain some more importance, and also this link to deliberate public processes with with different audiences is part of what we've done in the museum. We organized the German contribution of the worldwide views on biodiversity, where ordinary public discussed measures to conserve biodiversity, which is connected to conflicts, which was then negotiated at a global level. And I could imagine that this topic of climate engineering is also worthwhile to consider for some global views on climate engineering. Coming now to the topic of tonight, and perhaps also preparing a bit your interesting event on Thursday night. I think we are living in the Anthropocene. There are a lot of science, and humans really change the world at all levels. We start with genetic engineering. We are living in totally urbanized environments. And I personally find this hump indicator quite interesting. We may discuss the numbers, but the graphic shows, as probably you know, that nearly all in the world, humans have impact and take major parts of the netto primary production for their purposes. So the question for tonight maybe is, so is climate engineering just another facet of what we are experiencing in the Anthropocene, or does it have a new dimension? Perhaps we may discuss a bit later how it changed the interaction between humans, biodiversity, the atmosphere. But now I have the honor to introduce you to our panelists. I start with Rafe Pomerance. He is working for climate strategies as an independent consultant. And I think he dealt a lot with the impacts of climate change and is very much in favor to stop climate change. So welcome to you. We also have, after we've seen how the past have been, we have now Jamais Cascio working for Open the Future. He's a futurologist. So he is developing, I think, not only one future, but different futures, and is exploring different pathways. And the idea is that current politicians can make use of this and use it for their current decisions. So I'm also happy to introduce you to Rene Rospel. He's a member of the Social Democratic Party, and he's also a member of the German Parliament. And I think he is one of the, from the political area, best informed experts. He was also one of the initiators of what's called in Germany a big request on this topic. So welcome to you. I may ask you to come to this nice table. Kann ich mal. Was brauche ich? So the idea of the evening is that our three panelists, and they have prepared something that you get to know to them a bit better and understand their background in relationship to climate engineering. So our panelists now have 5 minutes, 7 minutes to introduce themselves and give their statements. And after that, we start a discussion, and be prepared. You are also invited. You can ask your questions. So welcome to Rafe. Perhaps you may start, because we started with climate.
Good evening. I'm supposed to talk very slowly. It's a little difficult, but I'd appreciate any feedback if it becomes impossible to understand. I'm honored that I was described as a scientist. I'm not. I'm a consultant. I have been working in the climate change field for 35 years, and in that time, I've talked to an awful lot of scientists in order to try to understand the system. But I was trained in economics and history, which actually turned out to be somewhat useful. Well, to give a talk under the influence of a dinosaur skeleton it's a good start for our topic about the relationship of geoengineering or climate engineering to nature. I mean, I thought of two things when I saw the dinosaur skeleton. Number one, if we don't get busy, we're headed right back to the Cretaceous. And number two, I thought about extinction, which is one of the major impacts that is forecast in a warming world, and actually has some relationship to the topic of climate engineering. My first comment is a huge amount of what I would call natural capital is now obviously at stake as the climate system changes. And I want to give a couple of examples, but that's one way to think about nature and climate engineering, climate change, and various emission scenarios. And I'll bring this forward in the examples that I use. My goal in my consulting, I have one project which is devoted to advocating in the US a more robust research program on climate engineering. There is some science going on in the United States, but it's pretty limited compared to the challenge that's in front of us to figure out whether there's a tool, what the risks are, what the potential benefits are. It's in its infancy, and you would be surprised at how limited the voices are urging more research in our capital. So that's my goal. Now, I wanted to just issue a sort of a challenge to the climate engineering research, or ask a question. I think we need to reframe, or at least add another dimension to the discussion. And I take 2012 as the year that turned it, when the Arctic sea ice reached another record low. And I think a lot of people were convinced by that the system was really changing very rapidly, much more so than anybody expected. And I would argue that the thing that will drive further research in climate engineering and further research in low carbon technologies or zero carbon technologies is focusing far more on specific impacts and the time scales required to deal with them than we have so far. And what I mean by specific impact, I'll give two examples. Number one is sea level rise. The most important electoral state in the United States is Florida, because it's a very big population. It can go either way. Both parties have to have Florida to win. The major threat to the future of Florida is sea level rise. Most of its major cities are built on limestone. It's porous. We can't build seawalls. So ultimately, and this issue is picking up a lot of speed in Florida, when the politicians finally wake up completely, they will ask the question of the scientific community, or they may, what are the means that we have to lower the rate and magnitude of sea level rise? They will at the same time say we have to adapt, we have to shift our entire infrastructure step by step, but they will also ultimately ask that question. And I think that's where, in a way, where the climate engineering question comes in, because the question is it a tool or isn't it in that context? Second example is the Arctic. As I mentioned, 2012, but the sea ice isn't the only thing that's going on. If you look at the cryosphere in its entirety, permafrost is thawing. The snow extent at the highest latitudes in springtime is retreating faster than sea ice, and that's a big albedo effect. Greenland is shrinking, and the Canadian and Alaskan glaciers, which are the largest content of ice in mountain glaciers, is shrinking very quickly. It's got about 1.5 feet or 2 feet of sea level rise. So the question is, what's the relationship of all the means that we have available to us, including the various emission scenarios, carbon removal, climate engineering, what relationship do they have to the cryosphere? It's another way to pose the question. We attempted in a workshop last April at Columbia, a multidisciplinary workshop, to ask that question. And the title of the workshop was White Arctic, Blue Arctic, Exploring the Restoration of Sea Ice. And then we looked at the different consequences of loss of sea ice, as well as possible mechanisms to stop the loss or even reverse it. I just want to touch on a couple more things quickly. Number one, in the United States, we will reach an important stage on this later this year. As most of you have heard, the National Academy of Sciences will issue a major report on geoengineering or climate engineering. And I think that all parts of the US government, both the executive branch, Congress, non-governmental organizations, all those involved in the climate issue, this report may induce people to think a lot harder about this question than they have. It doesn't get the attention it deserves, and I think this report could have a very significant impact. My final point is on one policy measure that I think we need to take in the US. We've established a new program in the Department of Energy in response really to the climate issue called ARPA-E, Advanced Research Projects Administration Energy. And it's a high-risk research agency. In other words, many of the projects are supposed to fail. They place bets on high-risk research that have large payoffs. In one that has one of its major missions is in the climate technology, low carbon, zero carbon. But it's small. It's only $200 million. We need to step that up to the size of what many of you may know as DARPA, the Pentagon's big research, which is about $5 billion. And I think a component of that has to look at the geoengineering technologies. But in a way, in one of the panels today suggested combining research in the geoengineering and low carbon or zero carbon technologies. Well, if we're going to do that, ARPA-E may be the place. I'm not sure it's a good idea for political reasons, but we need to step up our research in order to increase the likelihood that the phase out of carbon-based technologies can occur as fast as possible. And at the same time, if we have to buy time with the climate engineering technology, we need to do a lot more R&D. So we have a big investment we need to make in policy terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamais, what's your approach?
So I have to say that standing here in the shadow of a brachiosaur, diplodocus, kentosaur, the 8-year-old boy in me is squealing with delight. I've been doing foresight work for the past 20 years or so. And to put it simply, my job is to look at the big picture, to get away from the perspectives of quarterly results and short horizon thinking, to break away from conventional points of view by stepping way back. So I'm going to do a little bit of that tonight. Now, these days, much of my work focuses on climate disruption and topics like geoengineering, climate engineering. But here's a little secret. When we think in planetary terms, that kind of big picture, stepping way back terms, we realize that our actions don't matter, at least not in the long run. The Earth, as a planet, as a global ecosystem, will, over time, be okay, be just fine. After all, it's dealt with far worse than us. Environmental scientists may refer to this as the sixth extinction, but in many ways, human civilization is still a comparative amateur when it comes to wiping out the Earth species. You know, there's a past extinction event called the Great Dying, responsible for killing off probably 90% of all the species on the Earth at that time. And by the way, that's not the asteroid that wiped out these guys. Arguably, we're nowhere near as dangerous to nature as nature is itself. But here's the thing. Even after the Great Dying, life came back and over time flourished. Every extinction event has eventually become the catalyst for a new surge of life. Given time, evolution works. Environmental niches get filled. Species emerge and change to take full advantage of new planetary conditions. The animals and plants that we worry will disappear as the result of human carelessness and ignorance are really, in evolutionary terms, only temporary residents of the world. ephemeral, just like we are. The image we have in our heads of what the global environment looks like is just that, an image, a static snapshot of a dynamic system. This realization that the Earth will abide no matter our mistakes may seem like it's supposed to be liberating, but it's actually quite sobering. Because what this knowledge tells us isn't that we're free to do whatever we want, but that the brutal strength of our fears about what our human activity is doing to our world comes from its effect on us. The Earth may be fine, but the fragile webs connecting civilization to the planet's ecosystems won't. Now, we don't need to worry about driving the bees to extinction because the Earth will somehow be harmed. Given time, evolution will fill that niche. We need to worry about the bees because without them, our ability to feed ourselves will be eviscerated. Any anxiety we have about the creation of ocean dead zones or the collapse of fisheries is really about what these conditions will do to humanity, to the ability of 7+ billion people to survive. And the dangers from global temperatures rising by 5 or more degrees in the course of just a century, an increase so fast in geologic terms that it seems like humanity is somehow the warming equivalent of an asteroid. These dangers will simply make it impossible for human civilization to continue along its current path. So, does that mean civilization is going to collapse? Probably not. Humans are reasonably smart. As a species, we've survived massive natural environmental disruption before, and we did so with less knowledge and fewer tools than we have today. But unfortunately, that's not the whole story. When writer William Gibson said that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, he wasn't just talking about technology. Imbalances in resources, in power, in luck, all mean that a majority of the world's population already lives on the precarious edge of catastrophe. Now, from my big picture futurist point of view, it's easy to say that we'll adapt. But for far too many of us, that process of forced adaptation will be tragic and painful and deadly. Saying that the Earth will be fine isn't an attempt to absolve ourselves of responsibility, the responsibility for the harm that we've done to the planet. Rather, it's a blunt acknowledgement that the concerns we have about the world are ultimately, and I think appropriately, selfish. The health of the environment here in this moment of the Anthropocene is directly connected to the health of human civilization. We're not separate from nature. We're very much a part of it. In every sense that matters, the well-being of the Earth is thoroughly, intimately interwoven with our future. In other words, when we harm the planet today, we're really harming ourselves over the long tomorrow.
Thank you. Rene Rospel, you're now advocating the selfish humanity as a politician. So what's your contribution?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a really honor for me to talk to and to discuss the questions arising from the ongoing discussions on the future of climate engineering with such outstanding experience in the audience and on the panel. One remark at the beginning, scientific discussions are usually led in English, but the debates about science politics in the German Bundestag are always held in German. That may be the reason why my English is a bit rusty, so please excuse my German accent as well as my mistakes. I'm good in dialect, but bad in vocabulary, sorry. In my pre-parliamentarian life, I studied biology. During these studies, I came across the biochemical pathways poster from Boehringer. I don't know if anybody knows this poster. This poster shows in all its details the chemical reactions that take place in a living organism. This poster is about 1.5 to a meter large, and for non-biochemist looks like an enormous lot of circles and cycles and colored lines with letters on it. For me, it's the symbol of the enormous complexity of organisms and of nature itself. As a politician, I have worked on the regulation of different technologies like stem cell research and genetic modified organisms, which involve changing some parts of nature for receiving a certain wanted result. But quite often the supporter of these technology did anticipate or didn't mention unwanted effects. We normally hear the advantages of a new technology and not the disadvantages. For anyone who looks at the biochemical pathways poster, it is clear that if you switch one part, it will have consequences on the other parts. And if you move a screw at the left side, you will have effects on the right side and the middle, and you can't predict it. To remind me of that, the biochemical pathways poster is now hanging in my office in Berlin. I'm not an expert on climate engineering, but I have questions as a politician and as a member of this society. To make it clear, I'm well aware that humans have always changed nature, and I know that it is nearly impossible to live in a Western industrialized society and avoid changing at least some parts of nature. This is entropy. But we should be aware and very cautious when trying to change or manipulate nature, especially when our actions are irreversible. Our lifestyle in Western countries has already influenced by the environment in a quite negative way. Scientists show us regularly the bad and unwanted results, such as the reduction of ozone layer, the rise of temperature, or the loss of biodiversity. As far as we know, some of these results seem to be, in theory, reversible. That's why the international community has decided to take action. All these actions are summarized under mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. For example, do we have to change our way to producing and consuming energy? Germany and other countries have already done a lot, but still not enough to achieve this, but many goals still have to be reached. Other governments do not seem too eager to reach these goals. Some countries even decline to accept that certain problems exist, or they dispute the severity of the problem. This makes it quite unclear if we are able to avoid catastrophic consequences of the actions we and our forefathers undertook to achieve, for example, economic progress. Some experts, especially in the US, now argue that there is an alternative to mitigation, climate engineering. What this means, I don't have to explain on this panel. In Germany, we started to discuss those ideas in 2009, and we weigh the pros and cons of this kind of intervention. Because in 2009, the German Ministry of Environment stopped the German-Indian sea fertilization experiment LOHAFEX, which was to start in the South Atlantic. Only after lengthy discussions in Parliament committees, the scientists were allowed to continue. Since then, new studies and experiments have taken place. The German science community has published statements about the topic. Federal money is going into studying the different techniques and possible consequences. And just lately, the Office of Technology Assessment at the German Bundestag has published its own report. As far as I can survey this, there is no active German business or scientist who is campaigning for the widespread use of climate engineering methods. The majority of German statements say that we need more research because we don't know enough about possible positive and negative consequences. Many are also afraid that if we go further with climate engineering, it will reduce the international efforts put into mitigation. And I belong to this group. So why is Germany putting so much research power and money into this field? The main reason is, likely in nearly all scientific research, to learn and to extend our knowledge. This might sound trivial, but as I am sure a lot of experts have already said during this conference, we just don't know enough about the climate and the possible consequences of the different climate engineering techniques. For example, LOHA showed in the end that the hopes or positive assumption of seed fertilization were just too optimistic. In the same way, I hope that the scientific results help us to know more about the possible positive and negative consequences. Until now, the main scientific results support our pessimistic German stand towards climate engineering. And with this scientific support, we hope to have a better stand in the ongoing international debates about climate engineering, which we can't and won't ignore. To come back to the beginning of my speech, we have already changed nature a lot in the past. Some of the climate engineering techniques now proposed have the potential to make even bigger changes. Seeing all the potential unwanted results, we should still not consider any use of climate engineering techniques or big field experiments in the near future. More research is needed, including how and under which governance conditions on an international level decisions about any use should be taken. But our main efforts to fight climate change should stay in mitigation. This is the only way to make up for our mistakes in the past and to reserve nature as we know it for our children. And perhaps in contrast to Jamais, my job is to look the big picture, but to act for the living and the next generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A very little question, Herr Rospel. You said you have this biochemical background, and we just learned from Dr. Moore that the diatomies, which are so important for the carbon cycle, they also suffer from pollution. So would be a policy against pollution in the oceans, wouldn't that part of some kind of climate engineering or mitigation? What is Germany doing in that respect?
There are a lot of aspects. If we see that the ships made more pollution than all the land traffic, we should have a clear regulation of perhaps the diesel, which is, or the heavy oil which is burned in those ships. And I think that the main task of our generation is to save energy, to be more efficient, and to switch from fossil energy use to renewable energy. And I think that if we hope that climate engineering would help us, these main goals would be going in the background, perhaps, like this.
Thank you. I also have a question for you, Jamais. You described the past and all these big extinction events. And now we are looking into the future. And my question is, and you start describing is, evolution was so open. We had some bacteria and then they died because of the oxygen, and now the humans could arise. But is evolution not now being more set or more closed because there is less freedom for evolution because the humans are already there?
Well, one thing that we can do when we think about the human influence on evolution, it's really the human influence on the planet, is to think about human activity as another selective force. Basically, humans are an agent of evolution, and that can be a fairly stark observation because we are. I may make a mild joke about we are amateurs, but we're still driving species to extinction. Our activities are harming the present-day reality of the world. Now, the question is, as humans, as tool makers, as brains, are we able to construct, to come up with processes, with methods, with ideas that can improve the planet, serve as a beneficial agent of evolution, and do so in a way that ultimately reduces the harm that we are creating?
Thank you. Are there already questions from your side? Yes, one question. The lady.
Thank you. I would like to ask the members of the panel, the Ecuadorian government proposed the most effective and revolutionary way to deal with climate change, who was the Yasuni ITT initiative, who was keep the oil underground. I would like to hear the comments from the members of parliament about this initiative, and unfortunately this initiative failed.
Sorry, I did not get the question. Did you get it? No.
Some problems with the acoustic here.
Perhaps you come up or stand up. I didn't get it. And my panelists who are native speakers also didn't get it.
Thank you. The most effective proposal to deal with climate change came from the government of Ecuador, who was to keep the oil underground. And this is the ITT Yasuni initiative, who have a huge amount of oil in the most important national park of Ecuador, with the highest level of biodiversity in the world, and also with a population in voluntary isolation. The proposal was to get some compensation to keep the oil underground for the money that the country, which is a poor country, wouldn't receive to export oil. But unfortunately, this initiative failed. I would like to know the criterion of the member of the panel about this initiative, contrasting with geoengineering, which is far more expensive.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know, Herr Rospel, whether you can answer. I know that the German government at the beginning supported the initiative.
I'm not member of the climate considerations, no. But I think it's a good proposal, but how to realize it? We have in Germany, I can't say any details to this, but because I don't know the conference results. But we have a comparable discussion in Germany about fracking. I don't know is it the right word in English. If we try to get the gas out of the soil, or if we say we won't do it, and we let these resources for the coming generations, and they should decide if they would use fracking to get the last resources, or if they don't. And I think it's the right way to hire the pressure to make the decisions in this generations and the changes in this generations. And it's possible to do it with all positively advantages, to get a better technology, to get more economic power by using renewable energy and to use resource more efficient. So I think it's a good proposal from Ecuador to let the oil in the soil, but I don't know why this proposal, or I can suppose why this proposal wouldn't be passed, but I think it's the right way, but very hard to realize.
A little bit. So Rafe can add a bit.
I give you just a very short comment. The big question that your question about Ecuador's oil reserves asks is, how do we keep the amount of carbon in coal, oil, and natural gas below ground in the amounts required to limit atmospheric concentrations to a safe level? And what we need are two fundamental policies. We have to raise the price of carbon in every major economy in the world, and we have to invest sufficient money to produce cheap substitute technology as rapidly as possible. without a major reduction in demand due to pricing or other mechanisms, it's very difficult to keep the reserves in the ground.
Are there more questions? Here in the front.
Elias from Germany, Geoma. I have a question about from a perspective of philosophy that let's drop the concept of the geoengineering, think that modifying the climate and the earth. Do you think that this is one of the stages humanity sooner or later have to take too? Or let's take, for example, take an example for terraforming the other planets. And I think that humanity has much more ambitious to terraforming another planet than to modifying their own Earth. So if this is modifying the climate of the Earth is something for humanity has to take sooner or later, so what is the time, what's the correct time for the humanity to do that?
For whom is the question addressed?
I think it most address Cascio.
We as a species are already modifying and manipulating the global climate. We're doing it in a very haphazard, broken, thoughtless fashion. There is, I think, a good argument that one of the steps that we will need to take if we are to remain a global technological civilization, hopefully a multi-planet civilization at some point, is to take responsibility for what we're doing. It doesn't mean to control the weather or control the climate, it's to control what we're doing, to understand the results of the actions that we're taking to be able to make wiser choices. I don't think that we can say, well, it's a stage we all have to go through, but if you think of it as gardening, that we have a responsibility to this global ecosystem, and we can't just forget that it's there. If we know that we're going to be changing the planet no matter what, we've been doing it since we've been a tool-using species. If we know we're going to be changing the planet no matter what, we need to take responsibility for it and try to do it wisely.
Any question, please?
Thank you. I'm Zabardast Khan from Pakistan. My specific question is related to the ecosystem services, and I will specifically refer to the regulating services which are directly linked with the survival of the species and the climate. When we talk of the geoengineering, have we considered that what impact it will have on the ecosystem services and the survival of the species? Thank you.
Well, is there somebody from ESS? Because they've done a study on this. Who would like to explore on this more? Is one of your colleagues around dealing with this issue, Mark? Don't take it.
I may offer a comment to expand, to take your ecosystem services to talk a little bit more about natural capital and climate change and the Arctic, which I understand a little bit more than most other ecosystems or systems. But if you think about the ice sheets are very valuable. Greenland, let's talk about Greenland. Greenland stores enough ice that if melted would raise sea levels by about 6 meters. That's a service of a cold Arctic that we are unraveling. At what speed, we don't quite know, because it's accelerating. Another one in the Arctic, which is the sequestration of carbon and methane in the permafrost and methane hydrates. The amount of carbon in the form of CO2 or methane that could be released is vast. So the cryosphere, unbeknownst to virtually everyone, is one of the most valuable ecosystems, if you will, services on the planet. The cryosphere that we have known in this interglacial has kept a lid on, so to speak. And now there's a question about where it's headed.
Additions? Okay.
Thank you.
Please stand up. I think they have difficulties to understand you.
Let's see if speaking slowly helps. So yesterday, Eduardo Viola made an interesting remark about the implications of engaging the military environment in research. So, Rafe, you mentioned the potential advantages of bringing DARPA and the defense establishment, if you want, on research to accelerate research in the US. I'm not sufficiently familiar with this institutional landscape. I know that some of the robust statements that emerged from previous events, like Asilomar, like the Oxford Principles, involve very clearly the transparency of research, the public access, and so on. So my question, mostly to Jamais, although this is open to anyone who may comment, is what do you envision as the possible consequences of a rapidly growing research, but in the hands of entities like DARPA? What would that mean for the collective geopolitical reflections and actions with regards to the thought or the implementation of geoengineering? Thank you.
My comment may have been, I may have not been precise enough. I think the form of research that we have now established in the US, in the Department of Energy, not in the military, not in the Pentagon, but it was modeled on DARPA in the sense of how DARPA made investments, high-risk investments, to get results. It's a very untraditional form of R&D. So we have now set up, it's about 4 years old, an entity modeled on DARPA, but in the civilian agency to do high-risk research on alternative energy technologies. And we also have to house, I mean, if there's to be a serious research effort on geoengineering, it has to be somewhere. Could be modeled on that. But my point about ARPA-E, which is a civilian entity, it is a critical component of trying to drive down carbon emissions in the long run, because the key is the cost of substitutes and to the conventional fuels. So now, just to say one word, the militaries around the world have an interest in climate change. It affects security. It affects the Arctic Ocean is becoming an open ocean. Well, that's an issue for navies, coast guards, so on. And sea level rise, US naval bases are at risk. The largest naval base in the world, I believe, is in Hampton Roads. Very vulnerable to sea level rise. So there are military interests, particularly in the bases.
You have to remember that there are no good choices left. When it comes to climate, there are no good options remaining. We left behind the last good options a generation ago. And what that means is whatever we do to deal with the climate, whether we're talking about locking up Ecuador's oil underground, whether we're talking about geoengineering, whatever the steps we're going to take, they're going to involve unpleasant and difficult decisions. So just remember that beyond anything else, that when you start to think deeply about these issues, you're going to have to recognize that there are no good choices left. Now, one thing that is interesting about the military, it's very likely that we as a global civilization will need some kind of human institution that has a multi-generational perspective and a global reach and a large number of participants in order to carry out various projects, whether we're talking adaptation or remediation or finding homes for refugees. In the past, that would have been the Catholic Church. In the historical past, that would have been major religious institutions. That's not going to be the case these days. So ask yourself, what are the remaining global scale, multi-generational perspective institutions out there? And unfortunately, the list pretty much is limited to the military.
So if there are no options left, you only... No good options. No good options. There's no options. So governance for you is military. How do you deal with this vision as a politician?
I think that the military interest is one of the origin of climate engineering. I don't know if it's a very broad origin, kind of don't know. Perhaps some interesting. We have a comparable discussion, a very silent debate about non-lethal weapons, where there is a concept to construct genetic modified organisms which eat special oil components of tanks or something else. And there is a possibility to regulate by the bioweapon convention. But it's really not easy to regulate because it's non-lethal, and you can't really say this is a military interest to change some movements. Both debates, I think, show that in the end it wouldn't be successful strategies to do it in the military aspects, because you can't control really the consequences. So I think it's in the end not really of interest for the military because you can't concentrate it on the local areas you want to have to fight any people or something else.
Okay, so biopolicy in the future looks not so bright. The last question before we close this round, please.
Thomas Brun from the ISS in Potsdam. A question probably mainly to you, Jamais. I really like and share your view of zooming out a little bit and looking onto the human system as a whole, jointly with the Earth. And I personally like to think of human history as a process of learning, actually mainly focused about learning how to bring together the concept of life on the one hand and the concept of consciousness on the other hand. And I sympathize with your image of thinking of as being a gardener and learning to assess the consequences of actions. And my impression is that the process we are currently going through may be something like a learning process of globalization of this consequences overseeing. And I wonder, to connect this with the concept of geoengineering, from your perspective, what could be the contribution of the discussions around geoengineering for this learning process, how to learn better, assess consequences of our actions, particularly on a global level?
One of the things that we see historically, time and again, when we look at the broad scope of history of human society, is that ignorance tends to lead to unfortunate accidents. When you don't know what the consequences are going to be, or you have a very limited perspective on what those consequences should be, when you have ideological restrictions on what is allowable to consider as the result, consequence of an action, these lead to unintended consequences at best, disaster at worst. When we look at climate engineering, we've been thinking about this conversation that we're starting here with the first international conference. When we think about this question of can we be gardeners, what we're doing is we're trying to peel back the covers, trying to reveal to each other, to the world, what the variety of possible consequences might be. Not to say that this will happen or that will happen, but to say this could happen. We need to be watching for the steps along the way. That is a possibility. We need to be aware so that we can plan accordingly. The idea of becoming a gardener, of taking responsibility for our decisions, really requires us to have as firm as possible an understanding of what those consequences can be.
Okay, thank you. I think one common message all three of you posed is take action now. And I would like to ask you for a final one sentence for our audience. What can this conference contribute, or the persons here at the conference, and perhaps not such a dark vision, something motivating our audience? One sentence.
When I entered the parliament, I tried to realize one principle: only to make decisions which are reversible. Every decision must be able to be changed by the next generation, or in 10 years. not very easy. We're in the nuclear time and we couldn't change it. And GMOs and the other discussions and climate change the same. And you have to deliver the scientific backgrounds and baselines for the political decisions to make us able to make decisions which are reversible and not irreversible.
So my one sentence would be ready and willing to forgive mistakes.
I'd just offer congratulations to the conference organizers for helping to do the most important thing about geoengineering or climate engineering, which is to open up the discussion. It is amazing how constrained the discussion has been. It requires much more public dialogue, and I think this conference is a really big step along the way to opening it up across really globally. So my congratulations.
I can give the congratulations also to Mark and his team. I thank you. I thank you very much. Take the opportunity and move around a bit in the museum. I think it's worth and you have a bit of time before the buses leave. So thank you for being here. Thank you very much.